Gentlemen and assassins and ladies of the night, I call upon you this evening in the hope of shedding some light. I can't go into detail or finger on.
Hello, lovelies. Hazard a conjecture, if you would. Pray, who might this be? Crossing the threshold once more. Might it be the familiar grim one? Send word and alert your acquaintances. Alright, let's try and ease back into work with a review. This is Alpengard, a D30 based RPG, which I bought after meeting the creator on the Eclectic Goats panel, on the basis of their enthusiasm and my liking to support new fellow creators. And they have a lot of that, the enthusiasm, and a shiny website, and a lot going for them. So, in respect of that, this is not really going to be a review. There will be no scores. I don't want to seem mean or to be disheartening to someone when I'm striving to be constructive more. So I'm going to frame a lot of what I'm saying here as advice and imparting experience, and everyone involved can choose, of course, to ignore me and tell me to fuck off. There's an old term in the RPG industry, fantasy heartbreaker. This was a pre-OGL phenomenon where a lot of people figured they could just do D&D but better. And while a lot of the time that was true, you were still competing with the big boys. The game, the Kleenex of role-playing games. And so most of those efforts were pretty much doomed from the start. So they tended to create games that replicated the D&D experience, all the usual stereotypical nonsense, right? Elves, dwarves, orcs, goblins, standard issue fantasy realm. But they just did one thing better. Now these days those people tend to write OSR versions or settings or with their house rules or tweaked 5e, because that's something you can do now without legal threat thanks to the OGL. You can also see the same phenomenon expressing itself in other games in other ways. Gumshoe, for example, does investigation, arguably a lot better than Call of Cthulhu does, but it can never really challenge the top dog, right? Going back a ways, the Riddle of Steel, which you can get for free online these days, brought in a sort of SCA-informed, HEMA-informed, more plausible, if not realistic, combat, and did that quite well, just not much of anything else. So Alpengard is a whole bunch of 5th edition D&D, but better ideas, all collected in one place, and some of the choices I find a little mystifying, you might say. Which isn't to say it's bad. It certainly knows what it is, I think. Alright, so let's start with the cover here. The cover is not great, which is puzzling because there is a lot of much better art distributed throughout the interior, he says, trying to find an example. Even some of the kind of, I always go on about muddiness, right? Even some of the interior muddy looking art, where it kind of smushes together and you lose definition, is better than the cover. There are also illustrations like this one, which have some dynamism, show some combat going on. You get an idea of what's going on, right? Even though the colours are somewhat faded and watercolory, that's to me an objectively decent piece of art and better than what we have on the cover. And there's a lot of art, and some of it is really good, some of it isn't. It's incredibly mixed in terms of quality, but enough of it is good that I know, and there is enough of it that I know that they spent quite a princely sum, especially given the overinflated prices that tend to get charged these days. So, a lot of time, effort, and expense has gone into making this book and making it a nice looking thing. But then the cover is a bit of a mess. The logo is fine. That's all lovely. But in terms of the figures that are present here on the cover, it has that D&D 5e problem of people kind of posing. And it's also muddy. And it has other issues, which is weird, again, considering there is so much better art throughout the book. Alright, skipping over the usual introductory stuff that we have to put up with in most RPGs, we can start getting into the meat of things a little bit. The game angles itself as multiversal right from the start and makes a big thing of being balanced in terms that one character should balance largely with another, the encounters and so on should be balanced. I think this is a bad thing to aim for. That's a matter of personal choice. I also think starting out from the multiversal point of view, unless you're trying to produce a generic game, a universal game, is probably a bad move. But Alpengard sets itself out as being multiversal right from the start. And balanced. Balanced it's another false goal, I think. I mean, Rifts doesn't bother trying to be balanced, even pretending slightly to be balanced. Where balance emerges in games like Rifts, where characters can be grotesquely unbalanced with one another, is in terms of what the Games Master does. How they structure the adventures, trying to draw in the particular abilities of what the various characters can do. That's a GM skill issue, perhaps, but it is something you can address in the text. Not that Palladium historically has done a great job of that either, but where emphasis on how you play and good GMing practice and good player practice carries a lot of weight. But still, alright, system wise, now this game uses a D30. This is a bold choice, using a novelty dice. That said, Zochi dice, whatever you want to call them, they are a lot more available these days, thanks to the efforts of Dungeon Crawl Classics, and also thanks to the efforts of cheap dice producers in China, who churn out big sets of dice that include weird dice like D3s and other peculiar numbers. So plus you've got online die rollers, many of which will accommodate weird numbers or any number whatsoever that you want. So needing a D30 to play is not the hurdle that it perhaps once was, but I think it is still a little bit of a hurdle. And the D30 is the standard die that you use for the core system in place of a D20. Right, so in theory, that gives you a greater degree of fidelity. It leaves room for greater gradation in bonuses or penalties, whatever else. So, core of the system is this. You start with a starting number based on your skill, equipment, whatever else. Then you roll a D30 typically, but occasionally a D20 or a D10, and you add it on, and you check versus the difficulty number. Now, those are upgraded dice. You actually get better if you choose to use a D20, or not choose, but if circumstances or skill level or whatever allows you to use a D20 or a D10, you're actually better at whatever it is that you're trying to do. So those are actually upgrades, because whatever that dice takes away from the D30 is added as a flat bonus. So D30 becomes a D20 plus 10, or becomes a D10 plus 20, which makes results a lot more reliable and less random at higher levels of skill, which is quite clever and avoids some of the swinginess that you get using any single flat die. But while it's quite clever, it is also still a bit of a patch on a fundamental issue that comes from using a single swingy die to do things. Though a single swingy die is perfectly suited to heroic fantasy. There are a lot of rather obtuse language choices throughout the book. You know, people like to rename the Dungeon Master, well, because that one's copyrighted, to something like Games Master, or Referee, or Keeper, or even Hollyhock God, or other terms that nobody ever uses, instead defaulting to DM or GM like 99% of the time. But here, that desire to rename everything seems to go a lot further. For example, the statistics. All right, brawn, lithe, smart, wise, and glint. Not exactly just the descriptors, nor is it all doing words, but it's a kind of a weird mix of types of words that don't really necessarily go together. Like, you can describe someone as lithe, she's lithe, but you can't say he's brawn, you'd say he's brawny. So for consistency, you would think it would be brawny, lithe, smart, wise, and I don't know, glint is kind of charisma, charming, maybe, but there's no consistency in the use of types of word here, so it's jarring to the eye or the ear, I guess. There's a lot of similar choices throughout the book. Peculiar terminology that doesn't quite hit the ear right, or doesn't necessarily as easily convey the idea as it might, or things that are grandiloquent without a reason to be, like ascension points instead of experience points, for example, and so on. I'm not sure a lot of these were needed. You know, there are genericized terms that we use throughout multiple RPGs that are perfectly cromulent. But the word choices here are weird, and they often seem to jar somewhat against what the intent of the book seems to be. So it's a bit like taking a understandable stat like strength and changing it to myofibrillar density or potentia, you know, it's a bit meh. Pneuma is basically force of will, karma, luck, the ineffable hero quality, having been primed by Clive Barker to consider that as a word for magic. I'm not too upset by that one, but yeah. Calculated stats and values look needlessly complex. Now, I'll put it that way because they're not necessarily actually complex, but I can see how these formulas with all their parentheses and so on could be intimidating and confounding to a lot of people. Step-by-step English instructions might have worked better here, despite being less efficient in terms of pages. Spell out the operations that you need people to do. Not everyone's a mathematician. Not everyone knows the correct order in which you're supposed to do operations, whereas if you lay it out as a set of instructions in English and then have the formula, or vice versa, then it's all there for everybody, right? As I say, they're not actually that complex, but they look quite complex. And if you mingle the complex seeming mathematical formulae with the needlessly obtuse language, then you double or compound, square the amount of difficulty people have with grasping whatever it is that you're trying to say. So, for example, in calculating your nimble defense, it's 10 plus tier plus open square brackets, open round brackets, lithe plus smart, close round brackets, or open round brackets, lithe plus wise, close round brackets, or open round brackets, 2 times lithe, close round brackets, close square brackets, plus folk modifier, plus cal modifier, plus power modifier, plus object modifier, plus armor penalty, plus burden penalty, plus size modifier. Okay, so there you go. Stats range from 1 to 10. Now D20 stats, here we're talking in terms of the bonus, typically run from 1 to 5 for a mortal character. So you would think if you were keeping the same scale that you'd go from 1 to 7.5, 8, right? If you're adding half again to the scale, but here it's 1 to 10. So perhaps you can think of the scaling being a touch more heroic. As well as your stats, you have life skills and powers, and these things are the main things that combine to define your characters. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that also feels somewhat needlessly complex as well, including a particularly finicky alignment system called Life View, which takes into account ethics, empathy, and morality. So ethics are lawful, laxful, or lashful. Again, the choice of language is a bit obtuse. Empathy is hearted, detached, and wicked. Morality is outward, leeward, or inward. Decipher that without me spelling it out for you. I think you'll have trouble with some of it. You also have character levels. I've never personally been a huge fan of class level systems, but things are quite open here. You can have a sort of starting defining class, but you can grow beyond it into other abilities. So you kind of wonder why bother with a class system in the first place in that instance if you can just jailbreak it. But yeah, levels run 1 to 30, matching the die. There are also tiers. Tiers is an idea taken from D&D as well in several editions, I think 3rd, 4th and 5th. Tiers here are like that sort of heroic, legendary and so on, but more spread out, and also determines what is essentially your proficiency bonus. So grade 1 is dawning, levels 1 to 3. Grade 2 is beginning, levels 4 to 6. Then you have raising, levels 7 to 9, surging, levels 10 to 12, honing, levels 13 to 15, helming, levels 16 to 18, quelling, level 19 to 21, mastering, level 22 to 24, reckoning, level 25 to 27, and crowning, which is an unfortunate choice of words for anyone who knows anything about birthing kids, as levels 28 to 30. Classes are called cals or calls. I think using the K I would interpret that as cals, but I don't know. But you have assaulter, druid, exarch, monk, and wizard. Now these are martial arts style D&D monks. So what you really have here is a fighter substitute, 3 flavors of magician, and the monk is kind of martial artist that falls halfway between, I guess. One thing I found particularly difficult and somewhat annoying when I was using the book is that there was not a singular step-by-step character creation guide in one place for a level 1 character. So you have to hop back and forth through all of the book to make a character. A good way of learning a system is by creating a character. And I found that difficult largely due to choices about content order, things like that. So that's another barrier to entry, I suppose. The character that I came up with as a level 1 character only has level 1 plus 1 bonuses in various stats, and not even all of them. Can take about 31 damage if I calculated that correctly. Has 5 pneuma, which you spend to enact powers and do rerolls and stuff like that. His defenses were okay. Nimble 15, Fettle 14, Mindful defense 13, and had certain resistances to certain kinds of damage due to backgrounds and peoples that I came from. Skills was a bit of a weird one, because in order to use a skill you have to have at least basic training in it, which entitles you to roll 1d30, right? So all of the things that someone should be able to do, you already get that training level in, and then you get other ones from your background choices, your class choices, stuff like that. So you have your training level, and then you also have your bonus. I quite like that as an idea, but I found going through character creation that I often had the possibility of taking bonuses in skills that I wasn't entitled to use because I wasn't trained in them. So unless I took those training choices, and I had the option not to, I could end up with a bonus in a skill that I wasn't entitled to roll on. I'm not sure whether that's an oversight or I missed some particular line about what to do in this instance. I don't know. But yeah, my character was pretty underwhelming. While the game does present a lot of choices, you are fairly constricted at lower level. So with my character concept in mind, I was fairly restricted in terms of powers and capabilities that I got. Most of them were kind of static bonuses, like aptitude focus gave me a bunch of extra skill bonuses. Aspect of the assassin opened up choices to optimize stats in different ways. Health guard gave me more hit points. Way of the skirmisher and weapon finesse gave me additional capabilities and choices to play to the strengths of my character. Right, so that's pretty much an overview of the system and everything. Most of this book is system, so let's kind of skip over the rest of the system information. Oh, there is one thing I should point out. Kind of a throwback to old D&D, you know, Beck Me and that. Different character classes have different capabilities with different weapons, which manifests as different amounts of strikes that you can do with it, different amounts of damage, and if you're improved or advanced with that weapon, then you can do even more damage. Kind of like the old combat ranks and things, slightly less obtuse than that, but still fairly obtuse. So you hand one character a dagger, they can make a certain number of attacks, they can do a certain amount of damage. You hand another character the same dagger, they can do more attacks, more damage, but this is related to their class, their cal, rather than anything else. I can see how that can work, but here it feels like a lot of extra cross-referencing and paperwork when you may have just like picked up something to use in the middle of a fight. So that's a little peculiar. Yeah, there's plenty of rules about occupations, magic, technology, equipment, all of those kind of things. There's plenty there. Again, slightly odd choices in terms of language, etc. But perfectly cromulent, and you, if you got the slightest experience with RPGs, you know what kind of thing is gonna come out of the implications of the system in terms of equipment bonuses and all the rest. Now, as I say, it sets itself up as a multiversal sort of game. So it does give you some background on that multiverse and ideas about creating your own worlds and so on. There's a general sort of guide to theistic practices, including the absence thereof. More information on creating your own worlds within the universes that you create. And we do get a set background, which is meant to be the default. But this has been largely absent in the rest of the book, barely even implied. And how to put this? A game called Alpengard has certain thematic ideas associated with that title that you might expect to find in whatever fantasy world is associated with it, right? So either we're talking about granola cereal, Alpen, or we're thinking about mountains, right? Alpengard suggests, I don't know, adventurers moving across the mountains to protect and defend keeps, important passes, spending time sheltering in valleys, that sort of thing. But the default world for Alpengard is the Stone Meres. If you know your languages a little bit, you know that, mare, seas. So we're actually talking here about more of an archipelago. Now there are mountains, but mountains and mountainside role-playing is not the focus here. So there's kind of a jar there, right? Alpengard doesn't sound like a system name. It sounds like a setting name, but the setting is Stone Meres, which have little to do with mountains. You see my boggle. Right. There is a fairly useful set of appendices, which are good for when we get there. Yeah, which is like a glossary, very useful when you've used so much obtuse language. Pronunciation guides. Doesn't say anything about cal or kale or call there, unfortunately. An index. Why call an index a Sikh book? Doesn't even have a turban. I do appreciate the use of the Old English thorn, though. The character sheet is beguilingly less complex than the rules would imply, perhaps. And we get a nice little biography of everyone involved. Alright, so this isn't a review, but I'm going to say a couple of other things here as well. Alright, so let's use this as my guide. The rules and so on are fine. They're just described in an obtuse way with some weird language choices and mathematical formulae that are going to put people off. The use of the D30, I have a well-documented hate of novelty dice, but I guess Zoki dice are allowed now and easier to get, and there are online dice rollers and everything else you might need, so that's not a deal breaker for me. It was very difficult, or at least very annoying, to make up a character due to it not being a centralized process in the book. I would have excised the Stone Meres section, gotten rid of it, because that is a whole bunch of pages that could really have been used along with the pages that were used for a couple of sample adventures or locations. Those pages could have been used for a slimline bestiary, because the book lacks a bestiary as it stands. There are some monsters and so on the website but releasing a game like this without foes to take on outside of a handful of examples in the sample adventures, bit of an oversight, definitely decreases the usability. At the very least, the bestiary, even if it was a separate book, should have come out at the same time as the core book and perhaps sold as a bundle. That's missing. So if I were to sit down to run a game of this, I would be extremely limited in what I could do until more monster information and so on comes out. And as things stand, I'm unlikely to invest more money into this. So I have an incomplete game that I can't run that has a whole bunch of obstacles, albeit minor ones, and then one major obstacle in that the monsters don't exist yet. So I'm kind of stuck there. My other major gripe would be that it's called Alpengard, but there are no Alps. So I feel a little bit led up the garden path. Also, the art choice for the cover is not up to snuff, which wouldn't be necessarily aggravating, first release, new company, in people with a lot of enthusiasm, willing to put their own money behind things. Maybe it's someone who was involved at some level. You gave them a break, you gave them the cover. But given that there is so much other art in the book that is so much better than this, you gotta wonder what's going on there. Yeah, I have my own peculiar issues with cover art in the past, due to behind the scenes stuff and whatever else. But yeah, definitely. So this is not a review. This is a game that shows huge promise, or at least the people behind it, I think, show huge promise, but it is not fully realized here. But it could be, with a few changes. Easier language, better explanations of the mathematics, more consistent or better placement of art, different cover, a world called Alpengard would be a huge bonus. Some basic monsters in the core book would also be good. It is complicated, and there is an appetite for more complex, crunchy games out there at the moment, but it is not tied here to simulationism or an attempt at realism. It is crunchy but high fantasy. And it might be better for the designers here to take a look over at something like Adventurer Conqueror King for inspiration, if they are to consider a second edition or a revised edition or whatever else. I don't hate it. I don't want to review it because I want this to be taken more in the spirit of offering advice and help and assistance, and a review would seem too mean. As I say, there is a lot of promise here, and I can see where it's heading, and there's something worthwhile here, which unfortunately it keeps kind of getting in its own way, and I don't know that it's going to be too successful on that basis. Zang.
A lapidary of wondrous stones and a bestiary of sundry creatures are two OSR resources by Neil Coates, providing you with the alchemical and magical supposed properties of stones, and a bestiary of all the strange creatures in their original interpretations in medieval lore. Available at lulu.com, drive-thru-RPG, and post-mort.com.
Well, I look at it myself as the beginning, really, of an exploration. That's the reason we're exploring. You don't know what you'll run into on an exploration. What the sky looks like, what the stars look like. Do they still twinkle, or are they a steady light when you get outside the atmosphere?